L. Frank Baum had put the land of Oz behind him and was working on writing other things. But the commercial and financial setbacks he was facing was applying pressure for Frank to return. Hello, I'm Cody Goggin, and welcome to the Royal Historian of Oz. With lagging sales following Baum's decision to leave Oz behind, he found himself backed into a corner in some regard. His resistance to returning to Oz was palpable, and in a letter to his publisher, he wrote, "A lot of thought is required on one of these fairy tales. The odd characters are a sort of inspiration, liable to strike me at any time. But the plot and plan of adventures takes me considerable time." Still, his resistance was wearing thin. When he finally made the decision to put pen to paper on an exciting new adventure in Oz, it would become one that he considered one of the two best books of his career. It was also a popular success, selling 17,000 copies. He explained that Oz had reached out to him by way of telegraph, so as to get around the fact that he had isolated Oz from the outside world in the previous book. Over the telegraph, Dorothy would relay to him new Oz tales. The next book in Oz would be The Patchwork Girl of Oz, released on July 1st, 1913, and with artwork by John R. Neal. Ojo the Unlucky lives in Oz with his uncle, known as Unc Nucky. Together, they live in Munchkin Country. Their neighbor, the magician Dr. Pippet, has been working for 6 years on making his own magical powder of life. Pippet's wife wishes to have a serving maid and has built a life-size girl out of patchwork with the intention to have her husband bring the girl to life. Mr. Pippet has already created a talking cat made of glass, but when he tries to animate the patchwork girl, an accident occurs and both Unc Nucky and Mr. Pippet's wife are turned to stone. There are 5 ingredients needed to counteract the spell, so the patchwork girl, who names herself Scraps, and the cat made of glass, who is named Bungle, and Ojo the Unlucky, embark on a journey to find the ingredients needed. Scraps is very carefree and often recites poetry in a nonsensical form, similar to Alice in Wonderland by Lewis Carroll. Along the way, they meet a creature named Woozy, whose tail contains the hairs they need for their ingredients. But Woozy's tail hairs will not come out, so they take him along on their travels. The entire group is then captured by giant plants, but the Shaggy Man arrives to rescue them and lead them to the Emerald City to meet Ozma. He informs Ojo that the 6-leaved clover they are searching for is by law forbidden to be picked in the land of Oz. Then they meet up with the Scarecrow, who seems to fall rather mutually in love with the Patchwork Girl. Just outside of the Emerald City, Ojo believes he can pick a clover without being seen, but as they reach the gates, the soldier with the green whiskers tells them that Ojo is caught and he is arrested. Brought to trial in front of Ozma, Ojo confesses his crime and explains himself. Ozma pardons him and allows him to keep the clover after all. Then he meets Dorothy, and she and the Scarecrow join Ojo and Scraps as they continue searching for the ingredients. Then they meet Jack Pumpkinhead and several others before coming in between a war, which is between the Hoppers, who each have just one leg, and the neighboring Horners, who each have a horn on their head. But Scraps the Patchwork Girl helps them to get over their misunderstanding, and a thankful member of the Horners helps the group to collect the dark radium water that they needed. The groups head into Winky Country, where they meet the Tin Woodmen. It is in this land that they hope to find the yellow butterflies from their list. Ojo collects oil from the Tin Woodman, but when the Woodman finds out that Ojo intends to capture a butterfly, he strictly forbids it, and instead offers that they all travel back to Ozma to get advice on a path that wouldn't jeopardize the life of a butterfly. Ozma informs them all that Dr. Pippet's magic has been in fact illegal, and he is deprived of his powers. However, his wife and Unc Nucky are brought to the Emerald City, and the wizard restores them to normal. Ojo and Unc Nucky then are given a place to stay within the Emerald City. With the Patchwork Girl returning readers to exactly where they wanted to go, Baum and his publishers began work on a series of short stories based in Oz that were aimed at younger readers. The hope was that this would introduce young children to the world of Oz after so many years since the first book was published. This collection of short stories was called Little Wizard Stories of Oz and was released in 1913, first as individual short booklets, and then again in 1914 as the collected work. Around 1913, Baum was part of the founding of a social club called the Uplifters. The club also went on to include Will Rogers, Walt Disney, Spencer Tracy, and Clark Gable. The group was known to hold an annual party that included heavy drinking and the performance of lewd plays that were often written by Baum. These plays would be the only theatrical work Baum would take part in for the rest of his life. The club would ultimately purchase a plot of land, and each member was invited to build their own getaway cottage there. With the relative failure of the previous Tick-Tock of Oz stage production, Frank decided to borrow elements from its story and make it into the next Oz book. But it was also around this time that Baum's selling of his rights to the early Oz books came back to haunt him. Other parties were printing the early books and selling them for around 35 cents a copy, when Baum's new books would average around $1.25. With this vast price difference, sales of the second-rate versions of the early Oz books flew off the shelves, as sales of the Patchwork Girl of Oz began to slow. Still, Frank began work on the book version of Tick-Tock of Oz. It would be the first Oz book to feature a map of the lands, and it was published on June 19th, 1914. Queen Anne of Oogaboo, a small land just outside of Winky Country, sets out to take over Oz. But Glinda magically arranges so that the road they take reroutes and leads her armies right back out of Oz. Meanwhile, a young girl named Betsy Bobbin and her mule Hank have washed up on shore after a terrible storm. They arrive at the Rose Kingdom, which exists inside of a greenhouse. No strangers are allowed in the greenhouse, and they face trial, but just then, the Shaggy Man falls through the roof. Betsy, Hank, and the Shaggy Man are made to leave the Rose Kingdom, and they take the Rose Princess with them. She is Ozga, with a G, and a distant cousin of Ozma from the Emerald City. The Shaggy Man has been looking for his brother, who has gone missing. He suspects that the Gnome King is responsible. In their travels, they meet up with Polychrome, the Rainbow's daughter, and Tick-Tock, who both join them. Together, they all run into Queen Anne and her attacking army from Oogaboo. Queen Anne orders them to be seized and bound, but Private Files refuses to bind innocent women. After learning of the riches in the Gnome Kingdom, Queen Anne decides to march on the Gnome King as well. The Gnome King devises many tricks to reroute this group and to mix them up, including sending them through the Hollow Tube, which sends them to the other side of the world. There, they meet Tatiti Hoochoo, the Great Jin, who wishes to punish the Gnome King for using the hollow tube, which is forbidden. He sends them all back with a dragon friend named Quack, who is the Great Jin's instrument of vengeance. Upon bursting into the Gnome Kingdom, the travelers are all separated. The dragon Quack and his men are able to evade the gnome soldiers, but Queen Anne and her armies fall into a cave. The Shaggy Man is captured. The Gnome King begins transforming his captives into random objects, while Queen Anne works to escape the cave. The dragon and Queen Anne burst into the room at nearly the same time, and when the Gnome King sees the ribbon around the dragon's neck, he suddenly forgets all the magic he ever knew. Then Quack lays eggs, which are poisonous to gnomes, and they set off to chase the Gnome King away. After this, a new Gnome King is appointed, and he vows to help the Shaggy Man find his brother. He tells the Shaggy Man that his brother is in the Metal Forest. He finally finds his brother, but finds that he is cursed with ugliness by a spell left behind by the original Gnome King. However, a kiss from Polychrome, the Rainbow's daughter, breaks the spell, and the Shaggy Man's brother is left back to normal. Then, many of the soldiers and characters return home after a celebratory banquet. Dorothy hears Toto speak for the first time, as all animals in Oz can speak. And Betsy stays in Oz. The book proved to do well in sales, and the maps that Baum added to the book were warmly received as well. It was around 1914 when Baum's social club, the Uplifters, invested around $100,000 to begin a film studio, and they named Baum president. This would become the Oz Film Manufacturing Company. Their goal would be to bring family-friendly entertainment to screens where children were mostly being shown the early Western films. Baum wrote most of the scripts for the silent films, while the features were directed by J. Farrell McDonald. St. Louis, Missouri-born composer Louis F. Gottschalk would compose the music for the films. Like the stage adaptations of the Oz books, many changes would be made in the translation from book to screen. The first of these films would be The Patchwork Girl of Oz, but it would be a commercial failure, and its lack of success would put the studio on a troubled road that only declined as time went on. The next film would be The Magic Cloak of Oz, and thanks to the performance of the previous movie, the Oz Film Company would find it difficult to find a distributor for their second offering. It was followed by His Majesty, the Scarecrow of Oz, which also struggled to perform commercially. Though the studio did not lose money for Baum personally, the effort involved and ultimate failure of the studio may have been responsible for a worsening in his already fragile health. Eventually, the studio building was rented out to others and demolished. The company, however, would have its name changed to Dramatic Feature Films and be ran by Baum's son, Frank Jocelyn Baum, for a short time. But this too would soon fold, and the company would cease productions for good. The films they made exist today in various forms of completion, but some footage is sadly lost to time. Baum had hoped the final film would boost sales of the next Oz book, and though only by a modest amount, it did. The Scarecrow of Oz would be the 9th book in the Oz series, and would be one of Baum's personal favorites. It would feature characters from his other books, The Sea Fairy and Sky Island, and would be dedicated to his social club, the Uplifters. Captain Bill is a sailor with a wooden leg, and he sets out with a young girl named Trot in a rowboat. But a whirlpool turns their boat over, and they are carried by unseen mermaids to a cave. There, they meet a flying creature called an orc and travel through a dark tunnel. They arrive at an island inhabited by Pessum the Observer. Captain Bill and Trot then shrink themselves using magic berries and travel to the land of Mo. Once there, they eat another type of berry and return to normal size. They meet up with Button Bright, who is lost again. Captain Bill then gives the growing berries to some birds and asks them to carry himself and his friends to the land of Oz. They are set down in a field just across the deadly desert, and then the orc leaves the party to find his own home. Button Bright, Captain Bill, and Trot have landed in Jinxland, which is cut off from the rest of Oz. The former ruler, King Kind, was usurped by a character named Fierce, who was also usurped by a character named Cruel. A rich citizen of Jinxland named Googly Goo is trying to marry King Kind's daughter, Gloria, but she is in love with Pan. Pan is the son of the first usurper, Fierce. King Cruel and Googly Goo hire a witch named Blinky to freeze Gloria's heart so that she will no longer love Pan, but Captain Bill discovers their plan. The witch turns Captain Bill into a grasshopper to prevent him from stopping them and turns Gloria's heart to ice. But since her heart is now cold, when Googly Goo proposes, she refuses him anyway. She declares that she loves no one. Elsewhere, the Scarecrow discovers this by reading a magic book that records all of Oz's history as it happens. He wants to help, so Glinda sends him to Jinxland along with some of her magic to aid Captain Bill and the rest. The Scarecrow is captured, however, and nearly burned, but just then, the orc arrives with several of his kind ready to fight. Cruel is defeated. They then find the witch Blinky and turn Captain Bill back from a grasshopper. Then Blinky is shrunk to an incredibly small size and stripped of her powers. Gloria then takes the throne of Jinxland, and the Scarecrow, Button Bright, Captain Bill, Trot, and the orcs return to the Emerald City for a celebration. The Scarecrow of Oz was released on July 16, 1915, to a positive reception and good sales numbers. Still, Baum had other stories brewing in his imagination, and his path forward would be to return to the pseudonym Edith Van Dyne and a book series for young girls. This would become Mary Louise and the Bluebird books. Dealing with treason and a young female protagonist, Mary Louise would spawn 4 books written by Baum and would then be continued by other writers. For the next Oz book, though, Frank would use an interesting strategy. Baum took an unpublished novel he had written years earlier and adjusted slight details to make it an Oz story. This would mean that the 10th Oz book would feature almost none of the previous Oz characters and take place largely outside of Oz until the final act of the book. This would be Rink-a-Tink in Oz. Prince Inga is the son of the King and Queen of Pingaree. The King of Pingaree tells Inga a story of how he once saved the land using 3 magic pearls. The blue pearl gives its bearer superhuman strength. The white pearl speaks words of wisdom, and the pink pearl protects him from any harm. King Rink-a-Tink of Gilgad arrives in Pingaree, and soon after the people from Regos and Koragos attack and capture the King of Pingaree. The people of Pingaree are all taken into slavery except for Inga and Rink-a-Tink of Gilgad. So Inga secretly decides to save his people using his father's magic pearls. They sail to meet the King of Regos, and using the pearls, Inga overcomes him easily and his armies. From there, they set forth to Koragos, where they meet the wicked Queen Kor. Inga and Rinkitink sleep overnight in the palace, but upon awakening, Inga's shoes, along with the pink and blue pearls that he had left inside of them, are missing. The shoes are found by a charcoal burner who takes them home to give to his daughter, Zella. Queen Kor captures the now powerless Inga and Rinkitink and brings them both back to Koragos. Zella, who does not know of the power in her shoes, travels to Koragos to sell Queen Kor some honey. But Inga sees her and recognizes his shoes, so he trades to get them back from her. Using his regained power, he overcomes Queen Kor, who flees. Inga frees the enslaved people of Pingaree, but his parents are still captives, and Queen Kor pays the Gnome King to use his magic to keep them within the Gnome Kingdom. Inga and Rinkitink arrive in the Gnome Kingdom and find that the Gnome King will not release Inga's parents. But he allows them to stay overnight, and they are nearly killed by the King of Regos, and only narrowly escape by use of the magic pearls. Meanwhile, Dorothy of Oz has learned of these events and travels to the Gnome Kingdom with the wizard to confront the Gnome King. She has him release Inga's parents, and they return to Oz together for a short time before Inga returns to Pingaree and the others go home as well. Rinkitink of Oz was released in the summer of 1916 and continued the run of John R. Neal as illustrator of Oz. It carried a dedication by Frank to his grandson, Robert Allison Baum. It sold well, but readers were aware of how different this book felt from a typical Oz book and how little in common it seemed to have. At this point, Baum's heart condition was evident, and he had resigned himself to remain in Oz for his own commercial well-being and for his numerous adoring fans. Sales of the Oz books began to rise again, perhaps out of a nostalgia for simpler times brought about by the harshness of World War I. He would soon be working hard on yet another adventure for Oz readers to enjoy. But that is a story for next time on the Royal Historian of Oz. I'm Cody Goggin, and I'll see you next time.